Chuck, Michael, are we about ready to go? All right. Madam Chair, we are good to go.
Great. Welcome back, everyone, to the Board of Commissioners, Washington County Board of Commissioners work session meeting for Tuesday, February 2nd, 2021. The next item on our agenda is the Housing Production Opportunity Fund. So I'll turn it over to staff.
Good afternoon, Chair Harrington and Commissioners. For the record, my name is Ruth Osuna, Deputy County Administrator. I'm going to start off the presentation and then turn it over to Tommy and Jenny. Next slide, please. First, I'd like to call to your attention that the memo and the PowerPoint was presented for this presentation were updated yesterday to clarify final recommendation regarding the HPOF funds. And we wanted to clarify that after discussion with each of you and the Finance Department, the recommended annual budget total remains at $4 million with no special fund to hold unspent funds in any one year. And I'll get into more detail about that because that is discussed in the last slide of this presentation. And then what's new is this first slide. And basically this slide outlines what we will be discussing with you today. As background, the HPOF was developed a few years ago, but it has not come before the board for discussion. As part of this presentation, we'll provide some background and history of the fund. Staff will be requesting the board to consider expanding the original intent of the fund, which is to help multifamily housing projects cross the finish line, and to now include funding for home ownership and special needs housing, and to promote the development of or preservation of affordable housing. We'll ask you also to consider some policy recommendations around the original intent of the HPOF, which is to support permanent affordable rental housing and the funding criteria to evaluate those projects in this category. And then lastly, we'll be asking you to consider extending the $20 million commitment over a 5-year period at $4 million annually. Next slide, please. The HPOF was created and funded in fiscal year 2016-17 in the Office of the County Administrator. It was created to be the last in funding when an affordable housing development needed assistance to get over the finish line. It was also meant as a demonstration of Washington County's commitment to increasing the number of affordable housing units. Next slide, please. This slide provides the board with a history of the HPOF funding. This fund began with $300,000 and has increased to $4 million annually. In fiscal year 2019-20, the board made a commitment to increase the HPOF to support the development of affordable housing in conjunction with the Metro Affordable Housing Bond Program in the amount of $4 million annually for 5 years, or for a total commitment of $20 million. Because of the increased dollar amount in the HPOF, staff realized there was a need to review the use of the fund to ensure that projects were evaluated consistently based on a set of criteria. This would also ensure that the fund is more transparent and accountable and could reflect the different ways of addressing affordable housing needs in Washington County. Next slide, please. This slide shows 5 requests that are currently in the pipeline. All 5 of these projects have been approved for the Metro Affordable Housing Bond Program funding. These requests have not been approved and are waiting for the results or the outcome of this discussion today. And now I'll turn it over to Comey and Jenny. If you could move to the next slide, please.
Good afternoon, Chair Harrington and Commissioners. For the record, my name is Comey Calavo, Department of Housing Services Director. I'm going to be speaking to you about the affordable housing rental piece of the Housing Production Opportunity Fund, HPOF. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So for the 4 million that Ruth mentioned, we are recommending 62.5% or 2.5 million be allocated for rental housing. And we are also recommending a minimum request of 100,000 and a maximum of 500,000. The reason for the minimum is typically development projects have contingency budgets, and 100,000 is something between contingency and developer fees could be absorbed. 500,000, the reason for that is so we are relevant to more projects. If we don't have a limit, 1 or 2 projects could come in and take out the entire funding. Targeted income level, our recommendation is 80% median family income. And so 80% median family will be a family of 4 earning $73,680. That, as opposed to extremely low income, where the same family of 4 will be earning $27,630. This is 2020, year 2020 income levels. Typically, housing authorities and affordable housing are allowed to serve up to moderate income, which is 80% MFI. So that's the reason for this recommendation. Next slide, please. So eligibility threshold, we have 2 options, and after discussion with the board, we want to go forward with both options, even though we prefer the first one. And the first one is what Ruth mentioned, which is last in funding. Last in funding is the least risky for the county because typically development projects take up a lot of time and money and resources before they become real. And if you are in first and the unexpected happens, that money could be lost. So last in funding, as our recommendation, is about risk management. Now, there are cases where we may want to do upfront funding, as that's happened with one of the developments that was mentioned in the history. And the last reason for our preference for option 1 is to really mitigate all the perceived risks. We would need to have, banking or underwriting staff, which we do not have at this time, even though we have ability to review this thoroughly. Next slide, please. We also have a recommendation as to whether the Housing Production Opportunity Fund be loaned or granted into the project. And for this, we are asking the board to delegate that to staff. The reason for that is if you take 4 out of the 5 projects that received concept endorsement for Metro Bond, only one, Aloha Quality Inn, doesn't have a bank loan or low-income housing tax credits. Low-income housing tax credits, by definition, are owned by limited partnerships or LLCs, which by definition are for-profit entities. So if you give a for-profit entity a grant, depending on their tax rate, their marginal tax rate, they owe tax. So if, for instance, their marginal tax rate is 25%, then they only benefit from 75 cents on the dollar. So depending on the structure of the development in front of us, the staff could make a call whether to loan it or to grant the HPOF. Affordability period, our recommendation is 60 years. And because historically up through the 90s, affordability period was required was 30 years. And we recently had a development in Tigard, 172 unit senior housing that the owners essentially made a decision to exit affordable housing. They're totally within their right because they signed on as affordable housing in the early 90s for 30 years, and that time is up. So 60-year affordability is what is best practice nowadays, and that's our recommendation. Next slide, please. In terms of eligible applicants, we are recommending both for-profit and non-profit developers. And the thinking behind that is we want a product. We want the affordable housing product. Increasing supply helps the public good. And so that's why for-profit, non-profit, including the Housing Authority of Washington County, are eligible. And then for eligible geographies, we are recommending countywide because it is county general funds. And so we want to serve the entire county. So eligible geography is the whole county. Next slide, please. Funding cycle, we are recommending a rolling application because a rolling application allows us to respond to needs of development community as it arises. If we have an annual cycle, for instance, in January every year, that means if you have a crisis or unforeseen challenges in a housing development, after that date, we can't help you until the following year. And last but not the least, because many of staff well, in the housing department are paid from federal funds, and this work is not federally funded, we wanted to create a place where people could charge their time. We don't think we will use the entire 125, but a case could arise that requires more in-depth analysis and work and review. So that's why that recommendation is up there. And I believe that's the last slide for me. Thanks for your time, and we'll take questions at the end.
So do I need to wait till the end? Is there more presentation before I ask you a question on this piece, Comey?
It's up to you. Ruth?
You can ask questions. We've got 2 more areas to cover, but.
Well, I think it's a relatively quick question. Could you go back to slide 11? And it says the eligible geographies is countywide with prioritization for Metro Bond projects. And I certainly understand the leverage aspect with the Metro Bond projects, but is it in some ways unfair to those that are outside the Metro Bond projects to not have an opportunity to be moved down the list again? I'm just asking the question.
That is an excellent question. I don't think I have an answer. However, if we approach, we'll give them a due consideration. That will be cities like North Plains or Banks. And I think those are the 2 that are outside of the Metro Service District. To the extent there's a need there, we'll give it the attention it deserves. Yeah.
Okay. I think Chair had a comment.
Those jurisdictions are so small, Banks, North Plains, Gaston, that if there is to be an affordable housing project, the Housing Authority of Washington County would probably be involved. So we would have a bit of lead time on that project, so that I think we have timing flexibility is what I'm trying to get at, given the rolling cycle.
Thank you. And Housing Authority does have property in Gaston and in North Plains. We have a 12-unit senior housing called Caburn Terrace in North Plains. Then there's another affordable project. So those are the 2 that we're aware of. And then we own a home for public housing in Gaston.
Okay.
Okay, good afternoon, Chair Harrington, Commissioners. For the record, my name is Jenny Proctor. I'm the Program Manager for the Office of Community Development, and I'll be taking the next two affordable housing activity areas. As Comey had gone through his presentation on the rental side, you can see that a lot of the criteria are established, and that is because the Housing Production Opportunity Fund focused on rental housing has been in existence for a number of years. Next slide, please. So on the affordable homeownership side, staff is requesting the board's consideration of moving forward with this additional activity area under homeownership, but allowing staff to undertake program design and come back to your board with more of the details on the criteria scoped out. We'll be looking at a number of different models, and so that is why the criteria are not established yet, because the models may dictate the different criteria in place. Next slide, please. On the homeownership side, what we're looking at as a recommendation is that of the 4 million proposed, that 1 million or 25% would be allocated to affordable housing, affordable homeownership. The cap for that would be dependent on the model chosen, so determined in program design. The cap might be different in a land trust model versus a down payment assistance model. The targeted income level we would be looking at would be the same as what on the rental side is up to 80% MFI. And typically on the land trust model, I think that we see any households between 60 and 80%. A down payment assistance program, you might see closer to 80%. And under the Habitat for Humanity model, they actually have been able to achieve homeownership opportunities for households at 50% and sometimes even below 50% MFI. Next slide, please. Again, the determination about grant and loan would be dependent on the model. If you're looking at affordability into perpetuity, like the land trust model, you might be looking at a grant, and that model ensures affordability of the inventory in the county. If you're looking at a down payment assistance that would be targeted towards wealth building opportunities for the historically underserved, you might be looking at a different type of repayment structure, a loan, some form of forgiveness, but also a loan. You would also be looking at possibly a shared, an equity or shared appreciation model. So there are a lot of different criteria to consider in program design. The affordability period also is dependent on the model that you choose. Under the land trust model, you would be looking at essentially what would be considered permanent affordability into perpetuity. Under the down payment assistance model, you may not have an affordability period because you want the homeowner to have the ability to sell when they're ready to sell, but that there is some a loan tied to that investment. Next slide, please. The eligible applicants in this case would mirror the rental side, those nonprofit developers, for-profit developers, and then also the housing authority. Those might be potential eligible applicants under these programs, again, dependent on the model. And then the eligible geography would be countywide. Next slide, please. The funding cycle would be an annual competitive funding cycle, but we would like to look at that in program design as well to be sure that dependent on the model, that makes sense. On the administration side, we are proposing up to 50% annual funding for administrative costs. And like Comey said, that would be utilized as necessary. There may be years where that full amount of money is not used. Next slide, please. So we're moving into the third activity area under the affordable housing components. Next slide, please. So staff is requesting your board's consideration to move forward with a special needs housing program design. And that concept was envisioned really to look at projects that are highlighted in the consolidated plan as a need, but might not fit the typical models that are funded under the home program, under the low-income housing tax credit program, or under the bond, Metro Affordable Housing Bond Program. Next slide, please. The types of projects to be considered, one concept is a smaller housing model that is based on the rental side, but serving special needs populations. So we heard during the consolidated plan process of the needs of people with developmental disabilities, people with mental illness, survivors of domestic violence, these special needs populations where maybe a smaller concept for housing might be envisioned. Next slide, please. And then the other idea or concept is assistance to manufactured home parks. So we know that there is a risk to manufactured home parks in terms of the potential for them to be put on the market for sale, and the people who are living there, sometimes hundreds of units, are at risk of being displaced. So this concept comes back to a preservation model. The concept would be aligned with the state of Oregon's program where nonprofit, or where a manufactured home park community would look to form a cooperative under state assistance to buy their park. And so it's that concept that we're envisioning being able to support. There are state funds available, but they would not be enough to fully purchase the park. There would still probably be a mortgage, primary mortgage, a loan on the property, and this funding would help reduce the level of loan funding that they would need. And so really the focus of this, we don't envision that there will be a large number of these types of projects, but it is a tool in the toolbox for when a park sale happens and there is the potential threat of large-scale displacement. Next slide, please. The allocation amount for this category would be $500,000 or 12.5% of the $4 million overall, and the cap to be determined in program design with the targeted income levels at 0 to 80%. Next slide. Again, as this would be the grant or loan concept would be determined in program design as well as the affordability period depending on the project. Next slide, please. Eligible applicants would be nonprofits, for-profit developers, and the Housing Authority, and eligible geographies would be countywide. Next slide. The funding cycle would be determined in program design. I think that what staff would need to consider is whether this type of activity needs to be responsive to what's happening in the market, in the community. So that will be considered, and then the administration component would be covered by the other activity areas. All of these areas where we talk about to be developed in program design would come back before your board at a later date. So you will understand the full scope of the program, both on the homeownership side and the special needs side, before making any decisions. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. Now I'll turn it back over to Ruth.
Okay, thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Comey. I just wanted to also clarify that, as Jenny said, any of the program design will come back to you, and also to any funding for any project the board will have final approval. So the last item is the allocation of funding to the HPOF. And where we clarified in the memo was a discussion that we had with you as well as the finance department about the possibility of creating a fund where the HPOF funds not used in one year would roll over to another year. But after having those discussions with you as well as the finance department, we are not going to recommend that. So what we are recommending is to retain the original commitment of the $12 million for the development of the affordable housing in Washington County, and to allocate $4 million annually for the development of affordable housing. Our original understanding for the HPOF was that the budget contribution each year would, any amount of that unused $4 million would roll over from year to year. But we were recommending that a long-term commitment goal of 20 million be reached, that we recognize that there could be a fluctuation in funding in any one year with the minimum of 4 million budgeted annually. So what we are looking at is using any unused funding from the annual amount budgeted to carry forward funding to the future until the original commitment of 20 million is met, but not held in a special account. So that if in any one year, more than 4 million of the budgeted amount is needed for, let's say we get 7 projects in the pipeline, we would come back to the board for a budget adjustment. We think that this allows us, 1, to retain our commitment to affordable housing as a county. 2, it allows the board more flexibility from year to year in the budgeting process. And it also allows us to come back should we need more than the 4 million allocated annually in the budget. So that is where we've changed our original recommendation. We are not recommending a rollover and a special fund for the HPOF. Every year, should the budget allow, we would have a minimum of $4 million allocated, and then long-term look at funding 20 million, which may extend the program beyond the 5-year commitment. And with that, we'll entertain any questions that you may have. Sure.
Chair, your double mute is on.
If my colleagues don't mind, I'd like to kick off the Q&A session if we could. And can we please project that last slide? Thank you. I want my colleagues to know that I really pushed staff a lot on their proposal, but mostly because I was pushing myself as well. And after meeting with staff on this, I continued to really push myself to examine what was I trying to achieve and why did I have points of discomfort. And what really ended up happening for me yesterday after reading the updated material for staff is I had two related questions. Why $20 million? Where was that rooted? And why might it be important to have that timing flexibility over the course of time? And so what I did, and Comey, I'm going to rely upon you to help provide some critical thinking to this story I'm about to tell, because you have taught me, you and your team have taught me so much about the whole affordable housing realm. So I pulled out the material from the, my affordable housing notebook, and all of the work that you, the team, have put into particularly the Metro Affordable Housing program, but also other programs that you've taught me about related to even with supportive housing. And for example, with the suite of projects from the concept endorsement, including the most recent additional one, you made sure I understand the about $180 million that Washington County's getting from the Metro bond, how that concept endorsement suite is leveraging about $300 million of funds. And so when I hammered myself, really tried to examine why 20 million, it seemed within the scope of reason that 20 million would be an appreciable amount. But that is just the story that I'm making up in my own head. And so that's the first part of my related two-part story. The second part story goes to the 5 years. And what you have taught me, as I've seen demonstrated, is that projects take time. And as our most recent one that was just added, the Saltzman Road one, you talked about the pre-development and design work phase, and then the construction phase. And the construction phase really happens in about 2023. So, we have this suite of concept endorsement projects, but they line up with slightly different timelines. And that's where, after that briefing, and as you all were working on incorporating feedback, I was continuing to work on my own thinking. And so I hear that your current proposal provides for maximum budget flexibility, but I want to make sure I understand what happens from 1 year to the next year if the 4 million is not spent. Would it continue on for a full 20 million? So Comey, I'm really relying upon you to help me with that story of the 20 million and the appreciable 5-year time frame. Comments, please. Critique, please.
Yes, if I may, you make excellent points, Chair Harrington. Yeah, typically pre-development could take a year, sometimes a year and a half before construction. And so some of this investment, most of that investment is made by developers from their own pockets. And we as a Washington County, the 20 million, assuming we understand your board cannot make a decision binding on a future board. However, that 20 million is about 11% of the total amount of 180 plus million coming into the county. So it's good leverage. It shows that the county is relevant to addressing the affordable housing challenges, or put another way, have skin in the game. I don't think that's official language, but that we are indeed doing our part. So there's many reasons to do this. And then the last one is what we call the but-for test, which is the very first one, the Cornelius Library and Housing. But for that investment, that deal will not have closed after close to 2 years of pre-development work. And so our investment was what moved it to closing. And now we have a beautiful development housing seniors in our county.
And we know that affordable housing bond program hoping to spend
Five-
that out over 5 to 7 years.
5 to 7
right?
years, correct.
Okay. Okay. And so just to make sure I've thought of this right, in any one year, let's just say this year, hypothetical year X, if we don't spend that full $4 million, will those dollars carry over to year X plus 1 along with the additional 4 million? Yes.
That is correct, yes. I
Okay.
think that was part of Ruth's presentation.
Yeah. Okay.
It's our proposal.
Okay. Okay. All righty. Thank you, everyone, for listening to my story. It made me much more comfortable with the 20-year figure and making sure I was fully rooted in the extent of the program. And I'm comfortable with this at this point, but I'm anxious to hear my fellow commissioners' questions and our conversation. Does anyone have any other questions or comments? Commissioner Willie.
Well, I guess I'm a little confused. I thought this is not the first time we've had this presentation. I like the carryover feature of if we don't spend the 4 million, the reserved money is carried over into the next year. And again, just to facilitate the timing of projects. And maybe they aren't completely, we can't completely fund them in 1 year, but we've got the money reserved, blah, 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 so it carries over. And then I thought I heard Ruth say that they're not supporting that program, but then I read on this slide that we are. So I just want, I guess, confirmation that we are going to, any unused funds are going to be carried over to the next year.
Chair Harrington, Commissioner Willie, you're exactly right in terms of the confusion. What we had originally proposed, which you're correct, we had originally proposed that any carry forward would go into a special fund or be held for the HPOF. And we also, if you recall, said that this fund would accumulate up to a maximum of 12 million. What we are now proposing is that there is no special fund, that the 4 million, which is funded by general fund, if it's not spent, it goes back into general fund, but should we need it, it's there for us to come back to the board for a budget adjustment in that year that we need it. And so, for example, to Chair Harrington's point, you know, we chose the 20 million was really a function of 4 million times 5 years. And so in this recommendation, if you can envision $20 million and we spend 2 million in the first year, the 2 million that we don't spend goes back here to the general fund. The next year we get 4 million and we still have that 2 million in future years to spend. But we're not designating it in a special fund, which allows the board to have some flexibility should there be a lean year. So for example, in last year's budget or this current year's budget, we hadn't spent the 4 million in the previous year. So our original thought was we were going to have 6 million, 2 million that we had from the previous year to this 4 million this year. And we only budgeted 4 million. The board was able to take that 2 million that was not spent in the first year and use it for budget priorities. That didn't lessen the commitment of 20 years over the lifetime of this program. Does that help?
Well, I guess, can you hear me? I don't know, I can't see my mic. So it would just seem to me almost like that would create a subledger accounting so that 3 years from now, we have a need for more than $4 million, and somebody says, hey, wait a minute, back in 2021, we had a $2 million, we put $2 million back, so we want it back. And we don't, and it has a tendency in my mind then to get lost in the general fund of things.
Mhm.
And it's almost like we would have to reserve contingencies for that. Otherwise, there's no guarantees that that $2 million doesn't just disappear.
Right. So,
So I don't understand why we would not have
right.
a fund that we would retain this money in.
Right. So currently we are keeping track. That was one of our earlier slides that we had. So we are keeping track of this funding year over year and what we're using it for and which projects are being funded and how much each project is getting. So, and I know that finance is also doing it. So we're working closely with finance on this.
No, but still, okay. So let me make sure. I thought I heard something, something new. I hadn't. We have in your presentation here. I'm sorry, I need to pull that up. I had it on another screen. We had. Let me go back to here. So we were talking about the affordable rental housing, then the affordable home ownership, and the affordable housing for special needs. And kind of designating a portion of that $4 million into each one of these pockets. So is each one of these pockets going to have funds maybe that they don't use and carry over? And so now we've got 3 subledgers that we're going to be talking about?
No, we only have one, and all of these different areas will be in this one.
But if we don't spend the allocated amount for the affordable rental housing, does it just go back in the pot?
Yes, it's so there's going to be some flexibility here. So let's say that we have $4 million annually. And let's say that in year 4, we get another 4 million, but we don't have any rental projects in that year. And maybe the 1 million that we allocated for home ownership is not enough. What we would do is we would come to the board and say, our original intent was to fund 5 units of home ownership, but the nonprofit partner that we're working with can do another 5 if we can allocate 1 million more. So we would come to the board and say, in this year, we'd like to use 2 million for home ownership.
But would it be 2 of the 4, or would there be an
2
additional?
of the 4. 2 of the 4.
I guess I don't have a problem with that, but obviously we'd want to weigh in on that. But
absolutely.
But again, the carryover thing just concerns me. I think it creates a potential for an ask coming in the future that we may not be able to have the general fund to meet the ask. Whereas if we had the carryover money, it's kind of like, for me, just kind of like a savings account. If you put the money in the savings account, then it's out of your checkbook, But if I put it back in my checkbook, no guarantees when somebody comes back around and says, hey, we need some of that money. And you go, gee whiz, you should have been here yesterday. I don't know. It's just, to me, I'll rely on you and Comey and Jack to figure all that out. But that's just, I might be getting into this too deeply, and I apologize.
No, you're not. I will say that I really put staff through the paces in terms of what does it mean for us during lean budget years that we've committed to an annual contribution of 4 million a year. So I really think that I caused them to to step back and work with Ms. Angie and finance to say, maybe we should structure this differently. What I'm trying to, so what you described, Commissioner Willie, about, subledger schemes, it's perfectly on point, and I'm glad you're raising that, because where I'm at now, going back to where is the 20 million grounded? What's the nature of that? And the 5 years as well. And yep, I'm worried about those lean budget years, but I also know that we have an affordable housing bond for the region that we do need to have an active financial commitment role in. And so I've continued to argue this in my head, which is why I started off the discussion, because I was really a thorn in staff's side. They figured out a proposal for that budget flexibility at the same time that I've come back in and said, no, they were right. We need to keep to that commitment. I also hammered them on why a $12 million cap? Why not an $8 million cap? And so it got to the point where, forget the cap business, because the CAO and the finance manager can always come to us in a budget year and say, you have a goal statement of putting in this amount of money in the budget every year for 5 years. And it is way too hard this year to commit to that. So, slice it and dice it differently. We always have that discretion, irregardless of having a fund in the budget called Housing Production Opportunity Fund. So what I am saying is I'm comfortable going back to the original proposal of having that HPOF and the $4 million approach. And if we're in a bad way in a particular budget year, then we're going to have to roll up our sleeves and have those hard discussions. But unless that situation occurs, the fundamentals of why 20 million, why an annual contribution over 5 years towards that 20 million goal, I think is sound.
Okay, I guess I wasn't concerned at all about the $4 million. I think that's prudent, and I like the borders and the guidelines that Comey and Ruth have put together. So I think it's almost like that's aspirational, but we've got it designated, and we need to do that. So I like that part. I was more focused on, in the timing of things, if we don't spend all the money in those little tranches in one particular year, that we put that in our savings account. We don't throw it back we don't leave it in the checking account and then hope that in a couple of years we get it back.
Right.
I want it to be a savings
and by
account.
maintaining that fund, it's exactly what the outcome you're looking for. Yep.
Okay. All right. Yep. Good. I just wanted to
Am
make sure I understood that.
I'm correct on that, right? Comey and Ruth?
Yes.
Yes.
And Tanya? Yep. Okay.
So okay, thank you.
Yeah, we've really put it through the paces. So, Commissioner Fye, you had questions?
I do. This is an easy question, not a hard question. It's like where the money is going to go and how we're going to pull it out. And and this is the second point, like the ownership, the home ownership piece. And I don't know if I asked this in my meeting, my one-on-one briefings, Comey and Ruth and Jeannie, everybody was there. But I am wondering, we know that home ownership is one way to uplift people out of poverty. And I noticed that the amount allocated for this piece is 25% or $1 million. I'm wondering what the staff reasoning that was, and then also to see if there's a different recommendation of maybe allocating a little bit more higher amount than $1 million. And then also along that line, the targeted income level, the 80%, are you basing that the HUD recommendations, or is there an opportunity or conversation to have around reducing that so that more people could qualify? So that we're encouraging more people that may not meet the 80% MFI, the median family income to think about home ownership or lead them in that pathway to be a homeowner. And then also same thing for the rental. Like if there's a conversation or an opportunity to reduce that percent, it might be helpful to have more people qualify. And then the other question I had, so those are just two small questions. And then the other question I had was, what is the equity strategy within this funding strategy? How do we close the gap on the racial gap of home ownership? And how do we address and have that conversation with the community?
So this is Jenny. I will take those questions and then invite Comey and Ruth if they would like to add anything. Regarding your question about the 1 million and why that was decided upon for the homeownership piece, really, when we were working within the $4 million bucket, the majority of the funds was looked at as for the rental side of things, because the original concept was that the funds were to complement and leverage for the Metro Affordable Housing Bond. So that when the pot went up to 4 million, it was in conjunction with thinking about the Metro Affordable Housing Bond. So that was a starting point, was thinking, okay, the larger portion of the 4 million would go to support rental housing. Those projects are very, very expensive. And so of that 4 million, what would be a reasonable amount to provide for home ownership? So that was really the reasoning behind that. At this point in time, no decisions have been made, so that is scalable. Regarding the question about the 80% MFI for home ownership as well as for rental, we really looked at a target range of 0 to 80%. And so the 80% is really what HUD determines to be. Anything under 80% would be a low and moderate income. So targeting.
Oh, okay. I think my presentation was okay. I didn't see the 0 to 80. My apology. I thought it was starting at 80. Okay, yeah. Never mind.
Yeah, absolutely. So okay. A good range. And under the home ownership piece, the different models are targeting slightly different income ranges. So there are some models that get to lower median family income ranges, like 50% and even slightly below that. And then your final question had to do with the equity strategy, and that's very, very important for us regarding the home ownership piece. Really addressing the historically underserved populations regarding home ownership is a big piece of that. That is a factor laid out in our consolidated plan. And so that will definitely be a consideration in our program design. And we will definitely be working with Latricia and our Office of Equity and Inclusion on how best to set up our programs. And we will also be talking to our partners in our community who provide home ownership opportunities all of whom are doing amazing work in that regard already. So we will be tapping their expertise in developing the program.
Thank you. I think I'll just say one thing, and then Comey and Ruth can chime in on this if there's more to add. The income level piece. Sorry, my apologies. I didn't see the 0 to 80, but the point I was making was there are. So I'll just use myself as an example, right? We lived in low income housing. I'm a homeowner now. And I looked into those opportunities to help me, right? Like I was working and saving money to be a homeowner, but there were opportunities to provide me some assistance. Yet I think one person was telling me I was probably like $25 over the allowed amount. So I'm just wondering, people who were in those kind of, people who are working 2 jobs, really saving, yet could really utilize an opportunity to be a homeowner rather than being delayed. So I'm just wondering that piece of people who really are in need, but they're making $25, $30 more than what the qualification is, because it's pretty strict. Like you have to submit how much you're making, and it's black and white, right? Like when you're submitting and being considered to qualify these programs, it's super black and white. The numbers have to match up. And going through, I know that and remember, and it wasn't long ago. So how do we create an opportunities for people who are a little bit over the required or the targeted income level, yet they're not that far in advance and far away. And I feel like those are really people that, I don't know. I'll stop with my editorial piece.
Yeah, so we've heard your questions a couple times now, so let's try and get the answer.
Well, I guess first of all, yes, I totally understand what you're saying, because in working with our federal programs, it's really, really frustrating to want to serve somebody with the housing rehab loan and they're $20 over the income limit. So I get the frustration there. And these are not federal funds, so there's probably some flexibility. When you build in a limit, somebody's always just going to be over that limit. And so I think we could build in a limit and then still have somebody that's $20 over that limit. I think what I can say is that I've written your note down so that we can put that into the areas of consideration as we build the program. And we can also talk to our partners about how they might deal with that if they're working with non-federal funds or more unrestricted funds. So I definitely hear what you're saying, and I really appreciate the question.
But as Comey talked about earlier, he did note that we are reflecting limits such as with the Metro Affordable Housing Bond Program. And the sweet spot there was really 60%, but there was some room to go up to 80%. So this proposal does maximize that flexibility to leverage those additional dollars. Right, Comey?
That is correct, yes. And to Commissioner Fai's question, your board has the option to go up to 100% MFI, which would be $92,100 for a family of 4 in Washington County. But that would not be moderate income. That's on the high side. So you open yourself up to criticism for serving people who don't need it as much as. So policy choices. So your board will get another chance to review the program when Jenny comes back on the homeownership piece. and we all work together. So we have our notes, and we'll follow up.
Commissioner Rogers.
Sure, just a few general comments. One, I don't really have any big issues with the program at all. It's before your time, Comey, when I was working with your predecessor. I was trying to get Section 8, so you were around. I was trying to get Section 8 to be applied to home ownership, because I agree that home ownership is pretty important. That's really what builds wealth. And so I like what you're doing, but the only other comment I'd make is in regard to Commissioner Willey's point. Check the statutes. I work in them all the time in regard to the local budget law, and Alan, I see, is still on, and I don't know that he would know this answer off the top of his head. But the big difference, I think, that Jerry is getting at is if you try to make a commitment in the general fund, it's an annual budget. We all know that. If you wanted to put it into some kind of a reserve account, there's really no such thing. There's a unappropriated amount that you could do. You could try to do that. You can't take it out of contingency, because contingency is reallocable, and it only goes for 1 year. The only other option that he was bringing up was a separate fund, and the advantage of that is once you allocate money there, the only way to use it for anything else is to discontinue the fund. So that's a political decision. So you'd have to go in and say, this board, whoever that board is at that time, would say, we get rid of this fund, and then we're going to do what with it? You have to say, when you write up the ordinance, that you're going to take it back to the general fund. You'd have to have appropriations that particular year through the budget process or supplemental. And so what Jerry is proposing, at least I think that's what he's proposing, is instead of this thing, this kind of fuzzy idea of putting it in a general fund and maybe getting to reallocate it, why not put it into a fund, which I think that's a good point. And so then if a future board, which they can do it anytime they want, they would have to purposely discontinue the fund. They would have to purposely do that. And so Alan can take a look at the statutes. I'd be happy to direct you, Alan. You know I have expertise because I work in it all the time, but it's a good question, Jerry. It really is. And it's just how much do you want to tie it up? Because you can't do it in the general fund, no matter what people might say. Very difficult.
So what you're describing is what staff's original proposal was?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then based upon feedback from briefings, they modified that proposal. Yep.
Right.
But it has the weaknesses, as Commissioner Willey highlighted, as well as the strengths that you've just highlighted. Yep. Treese, did you have any questions or comments?
No, but I appreciate all of the dialogue, so thank you.
So based upon all of this, I haven't heard any commissioner concern about the 3 different uses that your proposal has. I think there hasn't been any concern about your recommendation on how to program each of those 3 categories, including the fact that you have continued, specification that you're working on. So really it boils down to, do we want to move forward with your original proposal that had the Housing Opportunity Fund that we would continue with the intent of funding that for additional $1 million per year, reaching the 20 million, or would those dollars reside in the general fund, having the thought scheme of the uses from year to year and retaining those funds? I think it's cleaner to have your original proposal with the HPOF, the standalone fund. It's harder. It's hard to claw dollars back if they're not spent, but we every budget year do have the opportunity to say, do we feel we have the flexibility to invest those 4 million. you know, I'll take responsibility for having a different scheme thought through. But I think that's where we've all ended up, being comfortable with that, a standalone fund that gets the contribution from year over year. Still towards the goal and completely with the use and the criteria that you've all talked about today. Commissioners, does that seem like the summary that we all seem to be comfortable with?
I'm comfortable. When does it start?
So what I'll do is, because we're going to have to bring this back to the board.
First,
Am I muted?
wait a minute. Let's get to that question first, Ruth.
Okay.
We started the 4 million allocation in 1920.
But we haven't created the fund. So when would we create the fund and transfer the money? That's my question.
Okay. So what I was going to say is we'll go back to talk to Finance Department and talk about creating the special fund. And then we will have a set date. So we didn't set it last year. We didn't set we didn't create the fund last year. We don't have it this year, although it's in our budget as 4 million. And then when we come back to the board for final approval, because this will have to be on either action or consent, then we can have it thought out and more clearly defined on the fund and the amount in the fund and the maximum amount. And I think that's where I think we would need some direction, is that we thought you said 12 million was too high. Some said 2 years. That's really a discussion for the board. Based on, I'll just give you this, is based on the expenditure experience that we've had in the last 2 years. We've spent at least $2 million. So it's also reasonable to say, roll over a maximum of 2 million and still give yourself some flexibility as a board when you're budgeting.
I would respectfully request then of the chair and the board that we take a look at establishing the fund right away. Doesn't have to fund it, but we could do that if everybody was so inclined, and then have the discussion that you're having in regard to funding. Because those are two different things. I mean, you could establish a fund.
Yes.
We could do that with any time, and then we could fund it. We'd have to do some budgetary issues, but we could do it. So I'll stop with that.
Okay. We
Part
can come
that
back.
I'm puzzled with is we allocated $4 million for this current fiscal year for this use. So I don't know why we wouldn't giving ourselves credit for 4 of the 20 million already. I mean, we did it towards that 20 million goal.
Yes, but the difference is, Chair Harrington, is the commitment of 4 million and expenditure of 4 million. So we committed 4 million, and this year we'll probably spend 2.5 million of it at the current pace that we're going.
Yeah.
So that would leave us with 1.5 million we haven't spent this year.
And with providing the scheme, that original 4 million goes towards the 20 million. You would account for those expenditures and continue to roll over those unspent funds.
That's right.
Not rocket science.
That's right.
Okay. Okay. All righty. We're marching towards the goal. That's the important part. And funds are accounted for. Okay. Great.
Thank you very much. We'll come back with some more answers to questions.
Thank you.
Great. I think we're moving on then to the next topic. Washington County Supportive Housing Services Staffing Update.
Okay, you have me again.
Clerk Moss, if you could promote Josh Kreitz as well. Thank you.
Yes, Tanya, he is not online yet.
Comey, why don't you go ahead and get started, and
Okay.
I will try to get a hold of Josh.
All right, he's here today. I saw him. We talked earlier. We're both in the office. So, good afternoon, Chair Harrington and Board of Commissioners. For the record, my name is Comey Calavo, Director of Housing Services. We have before you today, and I wanted to note that the presentation and memo were updated yesterday. So those updates will be included in your packets. So the supportive housing services measure, it is a historic measure and is providing close to 10 times the amount of resources to address homelessness in our county than what our budget is for homeless services right now. Our budget is a little over 4 million now, and the supportive services is likely to be 9 to 10 times that. The reason we did updates to the memo and the PowerPoint was to ensure that both the board and our community as a whole have an understanding of some key pieces. And we certainly aim to be very transparent. Number one is that the requirements and expectations in the first year of the supportive housing measure, including families and individuals that we are hoping to start serving come July with the initial disbursement of funds. The major bodies of work that our department is undertaking to ensure that we are prepared to meet those requirements come July 1, it's one of the updates you'll be receiving this afternoon. The staffing needs to ensure the required bodies of work can be undertaken successfully is the subject of our discussion this afternoon. So while we wait for Josh, we could start the slides. Josh Kreitz is Assistant Director. He will be walking through the details with you. So next slide. So supportive housing services, historic funding, as I mentioned earlier, the measure would is a huge infusion of resources into our plan to serve and to prevent and end homelessness. We are also committed to building equitable and transparent supportive services program, and we'll be working with our partners here in Washington County to get that work done. Next slide, please. This is
Comey, I want to interrupt you. Josh was able to finally get on.
okay. So I will hand it over to Josh. Josh, this slide is about the history, so take it away.
Morning, Chair Harrington, board. I apologize. I got a new computer about an hour ago and it seemed to cause some issues. So I apologize. Yeah, so I think Comey did a really good job kind of setting us up here. But what I really want to comment on here is, why are we coming to the board now? Why are we talking about staffing needs right now? So we want to have a really transparent conversation with the board and the community who voted for this measure, so they understand why we're coming forward with staffing needs now. So what's really important to notice is that the SHS measure was approved by voters after Washington County's 2020-2021 budget proposal adoption process. So what's also important to notice then is that Metro considers the first phase of the SHS measure's official implementation to be in effect in July of 2021, this year. So that means there's measurable housing outcomes expected that Washington County will report on for the period of July 1st of this year through June 30th of 2022. So simply stated, Washington County needs to be prepared to house individuals and families by July 1st of this year and provide the necessary services. So we understand that the implementation of this measure is going to be a multi-year approach that's going to require a lot of community engagement, a lot of board engagement, and really focusing on building out this system that will work for all of the members of our community. But we also understand that there's immediate staffing and budgetary needs to ensure that Washington County can be successful in implementing the program this year. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to read through verbatim everything on these lists, but what we wanted to do is really give a good, strong flavor of the major bodies of work that are being undertaken right now and that need to be undertaken as we move forward over the next several months. And as I mentioned, these bodies of work, please understand that all of this is going to require a lot of community engagement, centering equity in our work, transparency, and building programs with really close collaboration from our communities of color and individuals who have lived experience. So the LIP, the Local Implementation Plan, we spoke about that quite a bit last week. I'll just highlight, it's a lot of community engagement, it's a lot of writing, it's a lot of data analysis, and a lot of board engagement. Building out this supported housing services network. Again, Washington County has worked extensively with our community on building out an equitable contracting process. And again, we need to establish an initial network of supportive housing service providers with a focus on having enough culturally specific providers who can do this work starting right away. And again, there'll be iterations and we'll bring more providers on, but we need to have providers on board by July 1. Another large body of work is the tri-county planning that's taking place. And I want to just highlight that significant coordination with Metro and our partnering counties is already underway around data metrics, contracting, technical assistance, and building out a regional long-term rental assistance program. That's going to continue and it's going to ramp up, and we'll have more of that coming forward in the upcoming months. The IGA process, again, we spoke about that last week, so I won't go into detail. But again, our county council will be working with staff and Metro on getting an IGA in place. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thanks. Reporting and data systems. There are a lot of outcome metrics, equity metrics that Washington County is be responsible for reporting on, and also helping our network, our system of care that we're developing, report that up to us so we can get the metrics to the county, so we can get metrics to Metro and all the voters who have supported this measure, and make sure we have transparent data. This long-term rental assistance program, again, to house individuals, we need to have a long-term rental strategy. So basically, Washington County is working with Metro and Multnomah and Clackamas counties to develop a brand new rental assistance program. That's underway. It's been underway for the last 4 months. And so think about it as a new voucher program that's going to be zero barrier with different rules and higher payment standards. That work is underway. An intake and referral process to ensure that there's an equitable way for individuals who are going to access this program. How are they going to access it and get referred into services and housing? So ensuring that we really have good swim lanes and process flows in place for that. And then I'll just mention lastly here, technical assistance and capacity building. Again, staff with the county here, we're going to be building out a capacity building program for our community-based organizations and culturally specific providers. And again, we need to ensure that we have a really great system in place so that organizations that maybe haven't had a chance to work in Washington County can become key supportive housing service providers for us. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk a little bit about staffing in just a minute, but I want to just hit again on revenue planning and collaboration between counties. So Multnomah, Clackamas, and Washington counties will be receiving a portion of the tax revenue. Metro's estimate is $38 million for Washington County this year. And I just want to remind that the percentages that you see on this chart are based on county populations. After 2 years of collection, those will move to a pure dollar in, dollar out model. So Washington County really took the lead in the part of this negotiation to ensure that Washington County tax dollars were being spent on Washington County priorities. All counties are needing to add staff and resources to implement this really historic measure. Multnomah County is adding 13 new staff, and I should mention that's in addition to the 36 staff that they already have in their joint office of homelessness. Clackamas County is also starting with 9 new positions to staff up. Next slide. So the staffing plan here, Washington County, would require 18 staff. 2 staff are already hired. 1 is an existing will be shared with the program, which leaves around 15 staff that need to be hired. The staffing plan, we really took several weeks working with collaborating with Health and Human Services, with the Office of Equity and Inclusion, with County Administration, to come up with a comprehensive staffing plan that will allow us to meet all the different goals around community engagement, housing planning, equity-based contracting, ensuring that we have data systems that can support this robust system of care. And as you can see here, as indicated in the chart, the positions will be in the Department of Housing Services, Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, and Health and Human Services. Next slide, please. So Comey mentioned at the beginning, we made some changes to the slide deck. I'm taking language about phasing out because that can get confusing when you have a lot of different presentations with different phases. So this staffing plan, what it really does is just lines up. How are we thinking about staffing up for this so we can be successful? And you'll see that the program management and project management hires, those are complete. You already met Allie on a couple occasions. Jess Larson, who worked at Metro, she starts tomorrow. We're excited about that. And then, we're looking at March through May, really building up that support housing services team, the contracting positions, the equity positions, the community engagement positions, the finance positions, those public relation positions, really staffing up to make sure that we can implement this and work with our jurisdictional partners while we do it. And then that really important rental assistance team. Luckily, we have an infrastructure here in the housing department for rental assistance. So we can staff that up April through July to ensure that we can, we'll have rental assistance available by July 1st. Next slide, please. So coming back full circle of kind of why we're here today again, we laid out that there are expectations of the county in the upcoming fiscal year. We also kind of laid out those major bodies of work that are being undertaken right now and throughout the spring and summer, and also the staff that we believe are going to be necessary to complete this work successfully. So to support this work, there's going to be a supplementary budget request coming forward in March. And that'll be part of the spring budget adjustment in 2021. I just want to highlight that the money will be refunded by the SHS tax revenue in July of 2021. So before I put a figure out there, I just want to make sure that that's clear for the board and the community. And this is also an approach that Multnomah and Clackamas County is taking. So the county has dedicated $350,000 to this effort so far, with the staffing plan and the consulting plan that we believe necessary to be implemented successfully by July 1. That leaves a gap of around $790,000, which Housing Services would then need an internal loan from general fund to support the short-term cash flow needs. Again, that will be refunded by the SHS measure this summer. Next slide, please. As we thought about the staffing plan and the supplementary budget request, we're really trying to strategically align this with the outcomes and the goals of the board, of the LIP committee, Metro, and the voters who approved this measure. And so we really want to ensure as we implement this program that we build out a program that can equitably serve houseless populations in Washington County, build up the capacity of our homeless services system with a strong focus on culturally specific organizations. We need to have transparent accountability to the voters who approved this measure, to Metro, and everyone involved on how the funds are distributed and spent, and that commitment to tri-county planning. With that, I would like to open it up for any questions to our board.
Commissioners, Commissioner Willie.
Yeah, if you could go back a slide. Let's see, I'm looking at 9. And we're talking about supplemental budget request. So is the ask going to be for the $350,000 that'll be reimbursed, or for the $1,140,000? Is that what we need, $1,140,000 to get to July 1? Do we, or just the $350,000?
Hi, yeah, thanks. That's a good question. So the county's already dedicated $350,000 to this effort. So this would be an additional $790,000, which brings us up to the $1.14 million.
And that will be that'll be the supplemental budget request of the supplemental budget request will be for 790, and then in July 1, basically we'll get refunded $1,140,000. Correct. Okay. So then, if that's the case, I thought $1,140,000 was our annual budget. So, is $1,140,000 going to be our budget for the 21-22 year?
Yeah, so the estimated projections are $38 million in year one for this program. And so the year one budget for staffing, if that's what you're referring to, we'll be bringing that forward for the 2021-2022 budget soon. So we're still working on that end of it. This would be to get us to July 1st, the staffing and the consulting needs to get us to July 1st, which will be refunded. And then we'll bring forth the 2021-2022 budget through the normal cycle of the budget process.
Oh, okay. Well, I was confused into one of the previous slides that were talking about the Multnomah County allocation for administration and all of that. And I thought, wow, we're at about what, 4% or something, $1,140,000, I don't know, whatever percentage that is. Pretty skinny compared to what Multnomah County is, but that's not true. We don't know what our administrative overhead budget's going to be for 21-22 yet. This just gets us to July 1. So, okay, I get
That's
that.
right. Yeah.
Okay, that's all I have.
Any other commissioner questions?
I had similar questions that Jerry had. We need to project these things out over 2 or 3 years so we really know what's happening in terms of those administrative costs as we dedicate funds. So it'd be good if there was something that would show us what that projection is. And then secondly, and I don't know if this is a crazy idea, but this is a program that extends over 3 counties. It would seem that there might be some synergy in trying to hire people more jointly. Are they have to be so dedicated to Washington County they couldn't help out with one more Clackamas? I mean, I don't know. You're going to develop some expertise, it would seem, that would be transferable to others who are doing the same things. And I just don't know if there wouldn't be some availability of sharing costs with others so that we don't have to have them wearing our uniform necessarily, just a uniform of the region. But so one, can we get something that shows, I think that's what Jerry was starting to go towards. What is that cost and what's it look like other than the next 5 months? It'd be interesting to know so you know what you're committing to and how many people you're committing to for what period of time. And then secondly, is there any ability to job share, if you will? It's a poor term, but job share with other counties. I think you could build up it's going to be really technical expertise that they're going to have. It might be more shareable. So just a thought.
Comey and Josh, if I can take that question.
Go ahead, please.
Thank you. Commissioner Rogers, Commissioner Willie, we are thinking about those avenues. This is in essence phase 1 of starting to build the team for a successful SHS launch. The counties are working very collaboratively, just discussing implementation, looking at how we can share, because I think there's the personnel resource, but frankly, there's knowledge is sometimes even more beneficial too. So for example, the equity teams are already meeting together and having these types of discussions. So what I'll say is, even though the plan may not feel solidified, if I can say that word this afternoon, it is coming forward. And keep in mind, we are still working through the LIP process in the IGA. So I'm confident once you're presented with this next budget for consideration, the picture is going to be much clearer for the board.
Any other commissioner questions or comments? Yeah, I don't have any. I appreciated the clarity of the presentation and the updated memo myself. So great. Onward, how we go then.
Thank you, commissioners.
Thank you, board.
Great. Thank you, team. It's important work. We need you to be able to get to it.
Good luck with that computer, Josh.
Okay, we'll move on to the next topic then. The fiscal year 2020-2021 financial update. Mr. Leon.
Hi, good afternoon, Chair Harrington. Good afternoon, Commissioners. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon to take a look at the county's financials. So this is our quarterly financial update brought to you, and our actual data is based on December 2020 data. So with that, we'll go to the next slide, please. We have our usual four-part agenda. First, we'll go over the economic update of anything new that we're seeing from the economy. And then we'll go through the fiscal year 2021 financial performance, which are the actual data that we'll be looking at. And then the third agenda topic is the general fund 5-year forecast. And then last but not least is the watch list for future financial outlooks. And I have a question time built in for at the end of each one of these 4 sections, but please feel free to interrupt me in the middle as well if you have a question for any of the slides. Next slide, please. So we'll get started with the economic update first. Next slide. So this graph is from the latest December Oregon economic update, and what it says is the employment data. So the labor market in Oregon, it's as we can see that it continue to decline, and then there are different. So those different shaded areas are different unemployment programs that is being offered by the state. As we can see that the red line is that we experienced a peak back in April, kind of May-ish timeline, and they continue to decline. And that means our employment market are improving slowly, but regardlessly improving. Next slide, please. This is also the employment data, which is the Oregon employment by wages. And this is a chart that actually illustrates how disproportionate of the different income levels are being affected by the employment. As you all can see that the higher income level, the middle income level were affected, but at a much smaller rate compared to the lower income level, meaning the wage earners that earns less than $40,000 a year on their income. Although that all lines seems to have a slow climbing back in the decline, but for the lowest income earner, we're still seeing a negative 15% compared to pre-pandemic level. Next slide, please. So this slide is called Oregon Personal Income, and this is a measure to measure what do folks have a disposable income to spend. And that dotted line is basically pre-pandemic projections by the Oregon state economy, as you can see. And then the blue line is the actual that they're tracking. So those 2 peaks that you're seeing there is one, a boost by the CARES Act package, where primarily it comes in and help boost personal incomes. And then the second peak is the second federal package that was passed recently. So, and obviously without any new package, they're still anticipating a gap in the at the state economy level, and that gap is the difference between that kind of climbing up blue line versus the dotted line of their previously projected number. Now they have a gap that's kind of illustrated on a kind of sideway kind of way, but really the right way to look at this, that red arrow, which is added by Washington County, is the right way to look at this gap. You can see that red arrow is a little bit longer than their sideway arrows. So you're comparing the same timeline. And if you measure that timeline, the difference over there is about $16 billion. I'm taking a quick peek at my note. It's about $16 billion. And I did some of our population math for Oregonians, calculating our 4.2 million for Oregonian population. That equates to about $3,800 per Oregonian. Now, although at the individual level, that doesn't sound like a lot, but if you times that by 4 for a family of 4, that equates to about $15,000. And that is a lot of families' annual rental spending that is just gone from that. So it's still, that gap is still very impactful. And it's safe to say, as you can see, that by Oregon's economic projection, we're not closing that gap anytime soon. So without any additional federal stimulus package, without any additional assistance to our population, there will be a lot of families struggle from that. Next slide, please. Okay, I don't know if I'm stuck. I'm not seeing the next slide coming up. Next slide. Actually, we went one over. Let's go back to slide 7. Thank you. Thank you. Is everyone seeing slide 7 right now? Awesome. Okay, so this is a recession recovery. It's a very nice chart that Oregon Economic Office does. So basically, it compares all the different kind of recessions that we have experienced in the past couple of decades, including the 1973, 1990, the 2000, and then the red line that you see in the chart is the recession recovery chart that they anticipate for this latest recession. And you can see that we fall somewhere in the middle. So we had a couple of shorter recessions back in 1973, 1990, and then we have the longer Great Recession, which took almost 7 years to recover fully. So this one, it falls somewhere in the middle. They're projecting that it will take us about 3.5 years to fully recover from the bottom. Next slide, please. And then this is another chart about the recession recovery. Is specifically targeted on new Oregon businesses. So while that we know that our individuals, households are struggling, our existing businesses are also struggling, there's some good trend to see that our new businesses that is opening up is tracking fairly well based on 2020 data compared to the 2019 data. So there's some hope in the economy. It's not all lost that we don't have new businesses opening up. In terms of opening new businesses, you can see the two lines. The darker blue line is the 2020 data. The lighter blue line is the 2019, which is a pre-pandemic data. It's they're tracking with each other fairly well. Next slide, please. And then the state revenue, which is very important in terms of the revenue share coming to the county as well. The state net general fund revenue continued to be on an increasing trend. As we can see that they're anticipating that from the 1921 biennial budget for the state, it actually declined by a little bit, but they're anticipating starting from the 21-23 biennial, it will get back to a continual increase kind of trend. So that is some good news for the state revenue forecast. Next slide, please. And then I think it's worth mentioning about the video lottery fund. Obviously, that's an interesting area for our county as well. So this is measuring the entire state's video lottery fund. As you can see that we really went through that really big dip back in April, May, and then it has been jumping back as soon as those facilities are able to open back up again. And then we're still tracking, toward the end of last year, we're still tracking a little bit below the pre-pandemic level. But by November, we were fairly back to the pre-pandemic level. I want to note that in the state economy data, they did not include the 2-week freeze period that was implemented during the holiday seasons. So the actual data for out of that chart may actually fall behind a little bit again. Of course, if once those businesses come back up, I think we have a good trend to see that it should go back to pre-pandemic level. Next slide, please. Now let's take a look at the county-specific data. So the state has an employment office, and they track each county's data separately. So this is the targeted Washington County data that came to us, and the color that they use is not very easy to distinguish. So the green line in there, if you can see, is the Oregon data for unemployment. The purple line is the Portland metro area, and then the blue line is the Washington County's area. So the color is kind of hard to tell, but then I can tell you that the blue line, which is the one that's at the lowest, is the Washington County's line. We're tracking the same as far as the trend goes with the entire state's data, with the Portland metro area, but from a percentage of unemployment perspective, Washington County is actually the lowest compared to those two comparisons. Next slide, please. And then this is also county-specific data about the kind of jobs and the kind of employment opportunity from a growth and a decline perspective. So this first chart that I'm showing right now is a 1-year change. And you can see that the only sector that grew this last year from this November compared to November 2019 is the transportation, warehousing, and utility area. And all the other sectors actually had a reduction in terms of jobs. And obviously, at the bottom of the chart, you can see the leisure and the hospitality industry is the one that's hit the hardest with almost 25% decline in employment. Next slide, please. And then this is the 1 month comparison, comparing to the this November to October, just to see the latest trend. And we see some positive trend in the transportation, warehousing, and utilities area. Some growth in the retail trade area, excuse me, and then very little, but still growth in the professional and business services. Most of the other sectors kind of held steady, which from the state's data analysis says is not necessarily good news. That means that our growing back trend is kind of slowing down a little bit, which is not good. And obviously, the financial activities and the leisure and hospitality continue to lose employment from October to November. So that is the latest trend. It's that it is an industry that is still struggling. Next slide, please. So this next slide is about the county's businesses. And then this is measuring the consumer spending versus small business revenue. So essentially it's trying to compare, for the existing business that's still in place, how are they doing in terms of revenue goals? And then we can see, again, no surprise, a big decline back in April, and then kind of slow climbing back to almost pre-pandemic level. Again, this is a very average revenue measure. So the green line in here is Oregon population's consumer spending. The blue line in here is the Washington County's consumer spending. And then the orange line is Oregon small businesses revenue. So we can see that the orange line, which is at the bottom of the chart, is still experiencing a 14% decline compared to pre-pandemic level. So we definitely hope the economy continue to improve, and then our small business can kind of get out of that decline and then get back to the pre-pandemic level. Next slide, please. So that concludes this section. Is there any questions on the economic update? All right.
Jack?
Yes.
Quick question. So when will we know or have a better estimate, I guess, of lottery funds that are going to be available? Showing that chart, pretty significant impact. It would appear probably down, I don't know, 30% or more. When will we know those numbers for our budget purposes? Or are we still going to be guessing when it comes to budget time?
Yeah, so for our fiscal year 1920 and fiscal year 2021, that's where most of those impacts are. The budget is already there, and I do not have the latest number with me as far as how we're tracking for the budget, but we can provide that information after this session. We know that we experienced a decline, so we're not going to come anywhere close to our budget numbers. But what I have heard from staff is that it wasn't as bad as like 40% or something that we anticipated before. It's something a little bit healthier than that. So
well, and as you pointed out, we took most of the hit in the lottery funds in
this fiscal year.
Yes, in this fiscal year. So the 2021 budget, but then looking ahead at 21-22 shouldn't be as bad.
Absolutely. So based on the state's chart, we anticipate a healthy growing back on the lottery revenue. And unless something terrible happens, we experience another shutdown or freeze. But as long as that doesn't happen, we should expect a healthy grow back to pre-pandemic level on that.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. All right, not seeing any other questions. By the way, when I'm looking at the Zoom screen, I don't actually see everyone. So please feel free to interrupt me whenever that you have a question.
Jack,
next slide, please.
Jack, before you do that. Hi.
Okay. Yes.
I was waving my hand, but you wouldn't see. But
yeah.
This is all crystal ball stuff. We all know that. All we have to do is have a downtick in the amount of disposable income, or we're down an uptick in COVID issues, and it all changes. But are you going to show me in a bit, or us in a bit, the impact on tax revenues here in Washington County? Is that part of your presentation?
Yes, part of my presentation is to show revenue versus expenditures. It's not necessarily focused in on our tax revenue, but I can tell you that our tax revenue has not experienced a decline. We actually experienced, from our AV perspective, we experienced a 4.59% growth. And from a collection perspective, we haven't seen any trend of a slowing down collection rate. So that is positive news. we're being very cautious about it.
Yeah, the two indicators. I saw what you sent to us, and that I didn't see tax revenues, but that and any revenues in LUT, it would be a particular of interest to me to see how that's dropping off, so that we can kind of trend it. And this isn't going to be meaningful until about November, December anyway, because if the kind of a lagging indicator, we're going to see, in my opinion, some people who may not be paying their tax bills. And so that would hit us in really 22. So I didn't know how close you were tracking it at all, but anyway.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a great question, Commissioner Rogers. So our tax revenue mostly comes in 3 iterations, right? In November, October, November timeline, that's where we get the biggest portion of our tax revenue. And then we have another iteration in February, and then another iteration in May. So from this last November collection, we haven't really seen a significant changing trend from previous year collections. So that's what gave us a little bit of a healthy news. But we are definitely anticipating to keep our eye on this February iteration, and then to keep our eye out on the May collection as well. For LUT revenue, we actually do cover that in the later part of this presentation to look at some of their major funds on the special fund side in terms of their revenue level.
Jack, if I may add to that, we are planning for March 9th for a comprehensive LUT financial update as well.
Yep. All right, next slide, please. So the next part, we will go over the county fiscal year 2021 financial performance, which will cover some of Commissioner Rogers' question as well. Next slide, please. So this is the first chart table is to show you the county-wide numbers and general fund numbers. And we always compare 3-year trend, and we always compare the year-to-date data. And as I was explaining, the year-to-date data is as of December. So we're comparing how much revenue and how much expenditure we have realized on the actual side from July to December of fiscal year 2021 compared to July to December of the previous 2 fiscal years. As we can see, the county-wide numbers on the revenue side, we're actually collecting a little bit better percentage-wise at 34% compared to 32% the year before, although that falls off a little bit compared to the year fiscal year 18-19, which we were at 38%. So it's not it's fluctuating a little bit, but not at a level that we're super concerned yet. So we're keeping a close eye on that, but we're not flagging that as a problem yet. And then on the expenditure side, we're running a little hot than the previous 2 years. So we're at close to 31% compared to 28%. Again, it's a 3% of difference, which is enough for us to kind of keep an eye on it, but not necessarily raising that as alert yet. The bottom table is looking at the general fund. So, and that's where the kind of healthier news comes in, is when you look at the percentage compared to 1920, which is the partial year impact for the county. But if we only look at from July to December data, really the portion of the 1920 data we're looking at pre-pandemic level. So we're collecting about 56.6% of general fund revenue in the last year, and then we're coming up to about 59%. So that is a good news from percentage. And then our expenditure is at 49.66% compared to the 50% last year by December, which is also a positive news on general fund. So nothing important to flag over here. Next slide, please. And then moving on to the general government area, where we have 2 special funds in there. One is fleet services, the other one is central services. The fleet services is tracking quite well. Their revenue is down a little bit, but not to the level that we are concerned with. Actually, the dollar amount is up, and the percentage is down a little bit compared to budget. And then their expenditures is also went up a little bit, which is 39%, a little slightly higher than last year, but not quite. So we're keeping a close eye on that, just to be very mindful of service level and all the activities that's happening in fleet services. We're not super concerned about that fund right now. Central services is a little bit of different story. As you can see that our revenue has declined quite a bit compared to last year. We were at 44.48% last year, and then this year we're at 37%. This is contributing to mostly our remote working protocols, reduced level of printing, reduced level of paper usage. And again, it's good news for sustainability not necessarily bad news, but challenging news for central services to see, okay, what does our new business model looks like? And then obviously we starting to reduce cost by implementing different measures, including doing a little bit less frequent delivery, slowing down our supply and paper orders. So we're able to keep the expenditure at 39% compared to 44.95% the year before. So we're definitely implementing different measures. It's one that we're flagging right now just because it's a special fund that is supposed to cover its own expenses with its rate. So this is definitely an area that we're keeping a really close eye to. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Slide 19, yes, thank you. And then we are getting to the public safety and justice area. That's where we have a 3 special fund that is fairly large in those areas. Fund 234, the top table, is a local option levy. So our local option levy revenue is coming in a little bit under in terms of a percentage compared to the year before, but not enough to really conclude a trend difference. So we're at basically about 55% compared to 55.77% last year. And our expenditure is running a little hot. Again, not to the level where it's too concerning yet, but we're keeping an eye on it. It's 30%. As you can see that last year, our expenditure was at 28%. The year before was at 30.82%. And then moving on to the middle table over here, that's our fund 182, which is a district patrol fund. And that is actually the operational fund mostly for the patrol activities within the county. And looking at the revenue, it's coming a little bit slower in terms of percentage, but dollar amount wise, it still grew from last year. So we're at 27.87%. Again, not enough of a difference to really raise a flag. And our expenditure spending is at 43.59%. Compared to the last 2 years, it's a slight decline, which is a healthier news, but again, not enough difference to draw a trend conclusion. The bottom one is the community corrections, which is another large special fund in there. So our revenue came in quite well compared to last year, but not so much compared to the year before. We're at 43.84%. And then our expenditures were definitely running a little harder in terms of percentages. We're at 43% compared to 39%. Now, this is the one that we're still investigating on the reason why previously there were some timing differences on state's revenue coming in, but then on the expenditure side, it looks like that it may be contributing to increased activities because we're seeing compared to last year, we're seeing this different percentage jump in both revenue and expenditures. So this is why we don't have our finger put on exactly what it is, but we're definitely putting it on a watch list to work with community correction to figure out, okay, is this trend normal? Is this trend healthy? And is this sustainable for future years to come? Next slide, please. And the next slide is the land use and transportation area as inquired by Commissioner Rogers. So this covers the 3 largest funds within land use and transportation, and then tells the story of their revenue and expenditures. So starting with the road fund, which is the largest fund, 168, our revenue is compared to last year definitely was down both from a dollar amount perspective and the percentage perspective, 25.68%. It's not down to the level where it's like hugely different from last year, but you can see that if we look at 1 year behind looking at the fiscal year 18-19, that's where we see a declining trend of the revenue coming in. Now, on the expenditure side, we're definitely seeing a healthier decline as well. So compared to 31%, compared to 33%, the expenditure is tracking at 30.3% of this year. And that is on top of a reduced budget already. That is on, it's not necessarily a reduced budget, but it's a reduced actual numbers. So it's both from a dollar perspective and a percentage perspective, it's reduced from last year. And then looking at the middle table over here is the current planning for LUT. We can see that the revenue is coming in at a better percentage, but smaller dollar amount compared to last year. And then the expenditure is higher than last year from both, the dollar amount is smaller, which definitely is the result of the implementation of cost saving techniques that's done by LUT, but then the percentage still track a little bit higher when it comes to the percentage. So it's definitely one that we're flagged and to keep a close eye on. And as Tanya mentioned, that there will be a more thorough update from LUT on their finances. And then building services is a similar story. It's another fund that we feel a little concerned about. The revenue coming actually a little bit better in percentage than last year, still lower dollar amount as anticipated. And then the expenditure is at a higher percentage, again, also lower dollar amount than anticipated. It's another area to keep an eye on and then keep flagged as a close watch item for us. Next slide, please. So the next slide is housing, health, and human services. We'll start on the housing part. So for the Department of Housing Services, you can see that I have marked both of those percentages as green. So their revenue is coming at 41%, which is much more than last year's dollar amount and percentage compared to 18-19 and 19-20. And then their expenditure is actually at a reduced amount of 36.87% by December. So that is really healthy news on both the revenue and expenditure front from a financial management perspective. So kudos to housing. And then the next fund is the Metro Affordable Housing Bond. And then there is not much trend analysis of that particular fund. As you can see that we budgeted $86 million for projects this year. And as Komi previously explained, those projects don't kind of run on a 12-month average basis. They really comes in at different time of the year. So we see a very small expenditure at December, but we definitely anticipate some large spendings in the second half of the fiscal year. Next slide, please. Housing, health, and human services. Now we get to the human services, which is the other large special fund that is in the area. And then the human services, their revenue is actually quite well compared to last year, and then kind of in line compared to the year before at 80.68%. And then their expenditures is this actually one that we did not flag, which we should have. Is that their expenditure is at a little bit higher percentage compared to last year and the year before at 22.76%. It's more than 3% that's off from last year. It's definitely one area that we need to inquire about. And this is also an area that they receive a lot of state funding and then kind of cater their activities based on the state funding. So there may be some timing differences with the accruals for December. And then for health care of Oregon, this is the one area that we flagged because the number is drastically different from the years before. Although we do have the story for this one, it's due to the restructuring, which we explained the last year. Is part of the business model is changing in the health share of Oregon, and they create a new fund, which is called Fund 203, which carries a smaller portion of the activities. So that fund is actually tracking well. If we artificially combine those two funds, they're tracking fairly close to last year's activity. And just because this year is a new model, as you can see, their budget is greatly reduced because of the new fund. So the percentage is a little bit different from last year's comparison as well. Next slide, please. Now we move on to the cultural education and recreation area. So starting with the top table, co-op library services. Co-op library services revenue is impacted a little bit by the pandemic compared to 68%, 67% in the last 2 years. We're at 63.96%. So it's $31 million. So the good news is still at a better dollar amount compared to the years before. And their expenditures is at a slightly reduced rate of 50% even compared to 51, close to 52% in the 2 years before. So again, this is not a trend that we are too concerned about, although that we did flag on the revenue side to keep a close eye on to ensure that we don't end the year with a shortage. And then moving on to the middle chart, that is the fair complex budget. I would add the addition that there is a pending more thorough update to your board on the fair complex finances and the event center's finances. So this is really a high level preview of what we're looking at as of December. For the fair complex, our revenues are coming in quite a bit lower than the year before at 8.63%. And also our expenditure comes in at the 5.21%. Now this is both contributing to a decline in the TLT revenue, as well as there was some late accrual timing differences on the TLT revenue. But really the story doesn't change. Our TLT revenue is at a pretty vulnerable place when it comes to the fair complex. Although that is not at 8% compared to 56%. I can tell you that the actual news is a little bit better, and that will be covered in the later update for the fair complex. And then looking at the event center, again, there's not much of a trend to analyze because we're in a new year of business. But compared to our budgeted amount at December, we're at 20% of the budgeted revenue and 13% of the budgeted expenditures, which is obviously the revenue is impacted by the closure of the event center for non-public events. And then, but really the Fair Complex and the event center has been doing an excellent job in controlling the cost. So we are really keeping the cost in line with the revenue that's collecting. And that is also worth mentioning for the Fair Complex, which is the middle table, where the expenditures is also reduced in accordance to the reduction of revenue. So I have to say that I feel pretty confident for that organization to get through this hard time over there. And I believe that, yes, go ahead, Commissioner.
Since we're looking at the event center operations and realizing that we had the court system utilizing that facility for a while, that certainly was paid for out of CARES money, and that was helpful. Is that CARES income reflected in that $319,000 year-to-date revenue number?
Absolutely. That is the only tangible revenue that the event center has collecting. And I'll tell you the latest number is actually a little bit above $500,000. So this 319 is everything that has went into the books by the end of December. As you know, that the invoice always have a little bit of lag. So we have a little more revenue that gone in there in January, which makes the total number a little bit above $500,000.
All right, thank you.
Yep. All right, I believe that's the last slide. Next slide, please. Any questions for this section?
Whoops.
Yes. Go ahead, Chair Harrington.
I have a question on this section, back on slide 19.
Slide 19.
With public safety and justice, the middle section on district patrol. During COVID, there were times when we had employees impacted by having COVID themselves or having to care for a family member, just complications of COVID time. So if different patrols had to be manned by more overtime than just straight time, would that overtime usage show up in terms of more expense than otherwise projected?
Yes, so this expenditure that we're putting includes all expenditures, includes all personnel costs, all material and services, any other expenditures, and even include any capital, small capital expenditures. So yeah, it covers all. And the reason why you're not seeing a huge hike is one, the overtime, while we experience some, is not to the level where it's making a huge difference in that area. And
Great.
two, it's also offset by a little bit of the CARES Act CRF covered leave policy that we have. So,
Okay,
yeah.
Great. Thank you.
No problem. Any other questions for this section?
Nope, don't see any.
Okay, thank you.
If I could just make a comment, I realize the percentages are the part that you've highlighted where overs and unders and put on watch. But I didn't see, overall, I didn't see any huge discrepancies from the standpoint of actual dollars versus the percentages sometimes don't actually tell the real story. And so the percentages are bigger than the actual concern. And so I just, I thought overall, this was a pretty positive snapshot and much better than I think we were anticipating 6 months ago. So I think we owe a lot to the staff and you and everybody that's worked really hard to tighten our belt a little bit. And this looks much better than what I was anticipating. So thank you, Jack.
Thank you, Commissioner Willie. Thank you for your comment. It's actually a great comment we actually do look at both the dollar amount and the percentage, and you're absolutely right. Other than a few pockets of concerning areas, most of our business is staying fairly stable. The reason that we're looking at percentages in addition to the dollar amount is that one of the watch lists that will be covered in Section 4 is our spend rate. So part of the county's financial management policy is that we spend 94% in general over our budget. So we always kind of have in our finance shop, we always have a little bit concern to say, okay, is everybody trying to hold themselves to 94%? And that's why we try to kind of use that as a metric to see, okay, are they running hot or are they running cold when it comes to percentage of budget being spent? So very nice comment, thank you. Next slide, please. So next we'll get into the general fund 5-year forecast. Now I decided to start with the assumption changes to highlight what has changed from this last time when we did the financial update and then when we did the fiscal year 2021 budget. So the blue part of this table is what has changed from the time when we did the budget to the time to the last time where you had a financial update from me. And then the green part are newer changes that has changed from the financial update number 1 to this current financial update number 2. So I'll jump directly to the green part. It's the first update that we have, which is a bit of a good news, is our COLA calculation came in lower than anticipated. So not so good news for our employees, but really it's a good news from a financial management perspective, where we ended with a 1.8%, which is still a good COLA compared to the 2.5% that we anticipated. And then for the strategic FTE growth, because of that good news, and then building on top of the lower purchase rate than anticipated, so we are able to add back in a 1% FTE growth compared to the 0% aspirational goal that we had before. So that, I think that is more of a realistic assumption, and that is definitely to the board's direction, to CEO's strategy on where that 1% growth can be sustained. And then in addition to that, we have a previously anticipated a 2% expenditure reduction on both personnel services and material and services for 3 years consecutively. And then with the little bit of good news, we're able to reduce that to a 2-year consecutive assumption. So, and again, we'll get into that a little bit later. It's actually a 2% reduction after hard increases. So in the end, the dollar amount is actually a soft increase. So next slide, please. And those are the couple key highlights of the assumption changes, and that gets us to this chart right here, where I highlight some of the key assumptions. We'll start with the revenue. The assessed value for fiscal year 2021, which is the actual by now, we have a 4.59%, which is slightly better, but not much than our previous projection of 4.5%. And then we are still remaining very conservative when it comes to fiscal year 21-22 and 22-23. We're assuming a 4% AV growth, and then 23-24 to 24-25 a 3.5% AV growth. Now this is anticipating kind of slowing down on the construction industry. Of course, if we see a healthy growth back later, we will continue to update our assumptions to make sure that we match to the best of our belief. But right now, it's probably the best path for us to stay a little conservative on that area. Transient lodging tax growth. So for fiscal year 2021, we're experiencing a 25% of pre-COVID level. I'll tell you the actual is actually slightly better than this, but we're hoping for a little consistency to be built up for us to get a little more confident to update our assumptions. 21-22, we're expecting a 75% of pre-COVID level, and then 22-23, we're hoping for 100% grow back to that. That is somewhat in line with what we're hearing from WCBA or from Leah's shop of the travel industry and the event industry. It's going to be a 18 months to 24 months grow back of that industry. And then other revenue changes, we have the fiscal year 2021, fiscal year 21-22, overall revenue collection reduced by 1%. Now that is something on the property tax level, we're not really experiencing that. But property tax is only a portion of the revenue that we're experiencing on general fund. I would say for most of our over-the-counter kind of fee revenues, we're definitely experiencing a little bit of reduction. That's more amplified in the LUT area, but even for general fund fees, we're experiencing a little bit of reduction there. So the 1% is probably still a fair assumption there. And then for fiscal year 22-23, we're hoping for a full return to normal. That is definitely our hope for the country to get back there. And that's a revenue assumption. Next slide, please. So looking at expenditures, our FTE growth is now at 1% for the next 3 years, 22 to 25. And then our fiscal year 21-22 COLA is 1.8% compared to 2.5%. We're still trying to anticipate an average of 2.5% for the few out years, because that is a bit of a middle of the road assumption for the out years to handle any inflation that may be coming to us. And then other salary increases is assumed at 1.5%, and then the health benefit is assumed at 4% annual growth. Overall budgetary reduction is 2% for the next 2 years, again, after hard increase. And the hard increase is basically the combination of the COLA, the other salary increases, which includes both the, any of the reclassifications or promotional opportunities, as well as the step increases that is mandated by the union, or the our non-rep step increases. So that is thought to be 1.5%. So if you look at this year's number purely, it's 1.8 plus 1.5% hard increase first. So that's a 3.3%. And then based on that level, which the department have no control over, we're asking the department to reduce 2%. So in the end, you may see the dollar amount to have an actual 1.3% growth, but it's really at a reduced activity level because some of this hard increase is not controlled by the department. And then required actual spending is at 94% for the personnel services and growth. Material and services growth, it's we're assuming a 0% growth model for material and services because those can be controlled by the departments for the most part. And the overall budgetary reduction is 2% targeted for the next 2 years. Required actual spending is at 90% for material and services, and that is the same of the trend that we have seen in the historical years. And the other that covers the capital spendings, the debt services, and the transfers are actual spending rate at 100% because we have a very little room to really change anything in those areas and the budget.
Jack, can I ask a quick question?
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Before you switch, under your FTE growth 1%, is that based on what you think we can afford, or is that what we actually will need? Seems to me our FTE growth could be more than that based on the growth of our county and the demands of our services. So is the 1% based on what we can afford?
It's absolutely based on what we can afford. It's I have to say that my gut feeling that is there may be a little disparity of between that and what we actually need. But I want to qualify this is only regarding general fund. So the staffing add from the special funds, like what you just heard about the supportive housing services, is not covered under this. And then I thought it might be helpful to put a dollar amount on this as well, because based on our FTE spending from a salary perspective, 1% is really about 930,000. So we're talking about because I know that I have previously communicated 10 positions, 11 positions. So those are averaging like those 93,000 a year kind of positions that equates to 10. So that's what that 1% equates to in terms of FTE growth. It is what we can afford using the target of our general fund balance target of between that 15% to 20%. So if there's any policy changes in terms of the fund balance target, that definitely open up the door of any more affordability. And if we experience any unexperienced revenue growth, that I mean, this is an area that I hope that I'll be wrong, where we get more revenue, and because that we're fairly conservative, so there are times where we, I would say that it's more often than not that we experience some level of actual that we experience. So we, from that area, that we can afford a little more strategic investment as well.
So, I don't want to get ahead of you. So let me look at the next one. Next one's capital investments. So, how has COVID impacted our budget currently?
Yes.
And,
so
I'm kind of comparing it to this forecast, but just overall.
That's a really loaded question, and I'm trying to think where should I start on that. The short answer is it absolutely has impacted our budget. Actually, we're hearing from the departments to say, okay, our actuals are so different compared to the last year, especially in the health and human services area. That's where they are getting hit the hardest. So it's multi-way that it impacts our budget. So in one way that it increases our activities, right? In certain areas where our activities were really amplified. But then in another way, the availability of the CRF fund really helped offset some of those volatilities. If we have to absorb all of that activities using the county's budget, I don't know where we will be. I will tell you that you will not see the kind of stability that you commented on in the current situation. So the CRF fund really helped kind of iron out a lot of that flexibility, although that we still experience a different level of activities, but you don't necessarily see a lot of that in the budget or the actuals, I should say, for fiscal year 2021. And going into 21-22, our approach is still the same. Is we're singling out a fund 155, which is the CARES Act, COVID-19 Response and Recovery Fund, to kind of segregate those activities to keep the impact from a financial perspective on general fund at a minimum, just so we don't have to kind of reconcile those differences and huge volatilities in our budget. Hopefully that's at a very high level answers your question somewhat. Yeah, I'd be happy to kind of have more conversation about that, but that deserves another hour of a presentation just by itself.
Yeah, it was a little bit of a complex question, and I tried to make it simple, but obviously it can't be. But yeah, thank you for that off the collar response to that. And I get it. It's a hard answer and it's a hard number to come up to. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Commissioner Willing. Next slide, please. So next slide is our capital investment assumptions. And then as mentioned previously, this really hasn't changed yet. So our major general fund investment in capital is both on facilities and ITS. And then for facilities, our 1920 level was 5 million. And as soon as we are experiencing this recession, we reduced that level. And again, based on the affordability. So before Commissioner Willie come to the question, I will tell you, there's definitely some disparity between what we can afford versus what really the county is needed. So our reduced level is for fiscal year 2021, 21-22 is $3 million for facilities. 22-23, 24-25 is even at a more reduced level at $2 million. ITS capital, the normal level, I should say, 1920 budget was 3.5 million. And then in 2021 and 21-22 were reduced to 2 million and then 1 million for the 2 years after. And that was purely a way for us to really balance our budget to get the projection into the 15 to 20% range. Obviously, if we experience new revenue, we experience new opportunities, we continue to tweak those numbers to try to right-size our capital spending to meet the county's need. But just the current projected amount, I fully anticipate that there will be some differences between the need and what we can afford as a county. Next slide, please.
Okay, I just need to interrupt here for a second, Jack, since we're over time. I just want to let folks know who are involved with our executive session that we likely have about 10 more minutes for this presentation, give or take, but at least 10, I think. And then we're going to need a break for about 10 minutes. So if you want to tune into our executive session in about 20 more minutes, that would be great. Okay.
Thank you, Chair Harrington. And I will try, we only have a few more slides left, so I'll try to pick up the pace a little bit.
I'm not asking you to rush it at all, right?
Okay.
This is important information. I just wanted to give the next crew a better heads up.
Thank you, Chair Harrington. So the next slide is...
Can I actually interrupt? Sorry. Can you go back a slide, please? And I have flagged this previously for the board, and I just want to draw attention to this slide again and the assumptions. Jack has done a great job putting the assumptions together, but I do want to just flag the facilities capital. Once again, this is general fund. We are going into a facilities strategic planning process, but I just want to flag this again, that this is going to be an area that we will need to revisit.
Sorry, I'm fighting with my mute button. Also, with the ITS, the information technology category, as we're moving forward and wanting to see a web redesign and who knows what, technology doesn't get any easier with, all these hacking, bad people and phishing and all that jazz. So it really does say something that we're on another downward trend there as well.
Thank you, Chair Harrington. And both of you are absolutely correct. From a capital spending perspective, on both facility side and ITS side, those projects don't get any easier or any less expensive. So, so it's definitely one area that we would be happy to cater to the county's short-term need when it comes to affordability, but we definitely would advocate for the right size of resources when the time is right to position the county to be successful going forward. Next slide, please. All right, so this is a chart that you are all very familiar with, maybe except for Commissioner Fai, since you're newer to the county. This is a chart that I use to include in the budget process to provide to the board the information on how we're doing and how we're anticipating we're doing when it comes to tracking the board's fund balance target of 15 to 20%. So this chart is, the green line is the 20%, which is the board's directed goal of our fund balance, and then the 15%, which is the orange line on this chart, is the board's minimum that's directed for the staff. And then as you can see that for our fiscal year 2021, right now we're anticipating, based on our projection, to land at 17.92%. And then the 21-22 year, we run a little bit of risk of running below that 15% at 13.89%. And the reason that we feel comfortable is because it's, again, projection. And as I explained earlier, more often than not, we experience a little bit better revenue. We experience a little bit better saving in expenditures that I feel confident we may be able to close that 1.11 percentage gap when the actually shows up. So, and based on our projection, we should start to see a growing back trend starting from 22-23 back to 14.71%, and then 23-24 back to 15%, 24-25 back to 15.76% right there. So that tells you the story of, based on our projection, how do we think our finances will do. Is that the toughest year is actually this next budget year, fiscal year 21-22. And then after this year, as long as we can continue to stay very disciplined in controlling our cost, we should be able to see a healthy trend going back to that fund balance.
So Jack, one quick question. In 22-23, we've got revenue, a fairly significant revenue increase over 21-22. Could you, and then it goes back down in 23-24. Can you tell me what drove that one little blip?
Yes, so in 22-23, there is a fall, how should I explain this? So in our net revenue calculation, is the county's tax revenue minus the WCCLS tax revenue, and then minus the MISTIP revenue. So in 22-23, there is a going back in terms of the payout to the MISTIP, because that we had a debt service that was on the books, and then that's where the debt service actually rose off. So that's kind of contributed to a little bit of a revenue increase in terms of net revenue. But when you look at the gross revenue, it doesn't really change much.
Yeah, that's, I was kind of looking at that and the reserve balance and all of that. And so, you know, $20 million increase, but it didn't, the reserves only went up 5 million. So I see that. I think I see what you're talking about there.
Thank you. It's a very great question, because that is definitely a one odd year where when we have debt service rolls off, it does create a little bit difference there.
Yeah. And for Commissioner Fai's benefit, my other 3 colleagues have heard this before, but I've been advocating that we could entertain lowering the general fund minimum and target rates down to 10% and still be in very good municipal shape compared to our area colleagues. But even if we didn't lower it all the way down to that, about the 3% delta, well, it's healthier than 3%. We've got practically a 4% delta between 10 and the lowest point there. We're talking on the order of multiple millions of public dollars that we're holding back and not putting into action for the community. So that's why I have tended to be a fierce advocate for lowering those practical goals. So I won't belabor the point here. I just wanted to give her the benefit of hearing that. That's all.
All right, I think that's the last slide for this section. Next slide, please. Any other questions for the general fund 5-year forecast? All right, we'll move on to the next section, and which is the watch list for financial outlook. Next slide, please. So this list really hasn't changed, so I will go over this real quick. Is our external factor continue to be the 6 points that I can list out? Is economic recovery in the state and Washington County, the federal and state funding availability to the county, continued AV growth and property tax collection rate, trending and lodging tax recovery, employee benefit rate changes, meaning the PERS rate, the medical rate, and then the community priorities and needs. So those are all the factors that's outside of the county that we continue to navigate and then continue to keep our eye on. In fact, I think quite a few of your questions hit quite a few of these factors. So thank you very much for raising good questions, commissioners. Next slide, please. So on our internal factors, as I continue to highlight, our FTE growth rate is the #1 cost driver for the county. Obviously, we want to size the county to the right size of our services, but really that is at the cost of the increased expenditures. So that's definitely one area that we need to keep a close eye on. And then departmental budget to actual spend rate, as explained, is another area that that we need to keep a close eye on. Sustainable business and program models. So the departments are experiencing a little bit different culture this year compared to 10 years worth of economic expansion. And then this year, we're asking the departments to really look very close and hard to look for that 2% reduction. And that goes to that sustainable business and program model to say, how do we, and also the operational efficiency point is how do we continue business and service delivery, keep it sustainable, but try to find as much efficiency as possible. And then last but not least, we're learning the lesson through COVID is emergency preparedness is very important. And then the better we're prepared for future events, the less financial impact that we will have for the county. Next slide, please. So that is the conclusion of what we look out for the financial outlook and the conclusion of my update to you today. I'd be happy to answer any additional questions.
Commissioners?
Yeah, Jack, I have one, and I don't expect you to answer today, but maybe offline. We have a little different operating model than most other governments that I've seen, and that is that many of our general services are trying to be covered by fees and other means. For instance, I'll pick a couple of good ones. One, LUT, as we call it in other counties, oftentimes has a general fund support amount, simply because they have basic services for everything from code enforcement to doing certain other kinds of work. And we've always tried in the past to get enough fees to cover it. So I'd like to know if we've ever benchmarked against them. The other one is the fair. I'll take that one as an example. The fair in many counties is not supported by anything other than the general fund. I mean, if it's an activity for everyone, it's supported by everyone. So I'd be interested if we really were to benchmark our general fund operating against others. I think that we're probably charging not only our development community, we charge them what we can, but a little bit more than they should. And I think we probably have for fair activities, we're probably not subsidizing that like we should have a general fund. If we did those, that would have a significant impact on everything that you've just said. I mean, it would drag those reserves down significantly. But at some point, I've said what I need to say, but at some point I'd like to take a look at that. Maybe I have a few clients I can do that with, but I would be interested in seeing if we had some resources too. And it might bore everybody else, but from my standpoint, I'd love to know what is general government. I mean, we've lived for a long time on what is kind of a enterprise method of accounting, and that's fine for certain activities. For others, it's not. So it'd be interesting to have that intellectual conversation, probably offline, when everybody else is not glazed over on a Tuesday afternoon. But I will ask you. So that's it.
Thank you, Commissioner Roger. I don't think anyone's eyes is glazed over. I think you caught everyone's attention. And this is a policy decision that the board really need to discuss and come to that conclusion. As a staff, we follow your board's direction when it comes to general services and general government. I will point out, I would agree with you that different counties have different models when it comes to those services, whether if it's fee-based support, whether if it's general fund-based support. Honestly, I feel that I'm speaking without enough expertise. Actually, Stephen Roberts and Leah Perkins are the experts in those areas. One thing that I want to point out is that different counties also have different property tax rate to support their general services. And then obviously there's drastic differences among different counties. So Washington County, as I have previously explained, is at a little bit of a disadvantage when it comes to our permanent rate to provide general services. So that's part of the struggle compared to some other counties. But again, in the end, it's a prioritization that we staff is actually supporting your board to make for the county's general discretionary resources. You guys are on fire today. Just loaded question after loaded question. Go ahead, Commissioner Willie.
That's what you get when you have a couple of bean counters on your commission. I'm sorry, Jack, you have to deal with that. I know, and I'll be quick. First of all, I think I've always been adamant about when I was mayor, it was 15% is our reserve rate, and I still contend that that's where we should be. And I'm sure that'll be for future discussion. Overall, though, again, for years I've contended that our tax structure is not sustainable in a growing environment that we are in. And so when you talk about the tax rate, you're exactly correct. The county hasn't even revisited that for a very, very long time. And I'm not advocating that we certainly raise that, but I think it's just becoming more and more obvious that our current tax revenue system will not continue to sustain a growing county environment the way we need it to be. So that's just my editorial comment at this point in time.
Thank you, Commissioner Willie. All right, any other questions or comments from your board? All right, thank you again for your time spending with me today to look at the county's financial structure. And I will come back in another quarter to bring you the next financial update. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. Well, commissioners, that brings us to the public portion of our meeting. I would suggest that we take a 10-minute break, just a little bit more than a 10-minute break, and reconvene at 3:45 for our work session, our executive session at that time. So at this point, I would entertain a motion that at 3:45 we enter an executive session, and then we all follow that Zoom link for that. Yes, Commissioner Treese.
Are we expecting the executive session to be about 45 minutes? I believe that's what the agenda said. Is that correct?
Well, that's what the agenda estimated, but I think it'll probably take longer than that, but it depends upon how good you were all at reading the advanced material.
Okay, thank you for the just the thumb check. Appreciate it.
So do we have a motion to enter into at 3:45 an executive session pursuant to ORS 192.660 sub 2 sub I? Commissioner
So
Rogers moved. Commissioner Willie will second. All those in favor, please vote by saying aye. Aye. I see it's 5-0. So see you all at 3:45 for our executive session for the annual review for our Clean Water Services CEO.
And that's under a different Zoom. So we exit this meeting. Yep.